Albert asks, it's related to what we're talking about. So, what happened to people before Jesus died on the cross? Are the Gentiles doomed? What happened to the Aztecs? Are they in heaven or hell? Thank you.
Well, the Aztecs who ritually sacrificed themselves to pagan gods, I can tell you where they are. But the point being made and the assumption that's falsely made, especially by atheists, is that, oh yeah, when Jesus died for people, that's now how you can go to heaven. Everyone before that time, well, so much for you. Obviously, like 98% of every atheist claim you hear on the internet is based on a lack of information.
Right.
First of all, when it comes to the first
half the truth is still a lie.
And 90% of a lie is in fact a lie. Yeah. So when we're talking about this issue of could people get quote unquote saved before Messiah physically showed up on the world scene? Well, it would basically be the same argument in saying, since we didn't live to see Messiah, how do we get saved? We have to, from a historical perspective, looking back at the eyewitnesses, be able to say, I consider their testimony adequate, that it is based on that belief, that acknowledgement of fact in a present to past tense. I acknowledge that Jesus was who he was and how he proved it. The people in the Old Covenant, then, I have to make this inference, but I have evidence for it, and we'll take this piece by piece, will, of course, follow the same program. The only difference isn't in the type of God who saves, or the means by which God would, notice not had, would save them, is perspective. If I have to look back, they would have had to have looked forward. Are there then, and this is what's key, any examples of this kind of relationship with God being acknowledged outside of the Jewish nation in the Old Testament before Messiah ever came on the world scene? People who weren't a part of the covenant of Abraham, people who weren't a part of the sacrificial system, people who didn't know the Ten Commandments, but still knew and benefited from the promises of God.
I got one. It's in Genesis chapter 14. We were told that after Abraham, the first one that God made his covenant with, was victorious over a coalition of Canaanite kings. We are told that when he returned from this battle, in Genesis 14 and verse 18, it says, Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be the Abraham of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hands. And he, Abraham, gave him a tithe of all.
Now, Salem at this time, it would be Jerusalem in about maybe 500 years or so. But what's the interesting aspect of Melchizedek's character? He was a Jebusite king.
He was a full-fledged Gentile, a Canaanite, if you will.
Well, there's some people who claim that Melchizedek was an appearance of Jesus, so he wouldn't technically count. What about, say, for example...
But there's no evidence to suggest that he was.
Oh, well, we're going to get all factual, are we? Well, let's give that the benefit of the doubt and ask, okay, are there other examples, people who are undoubtedly human that weren't Jewish but still benefited from confidence in the Jewish Messiah?
I know another one. Ruth.
Oh, a Moabite.
Yeah.
Who was married into the covenant. Well, she was practicing. What about association? We might maybe reference, what was the friend, very famously, interestingly enough, of David's soon-to-be wife, Bathsheba? What was her first husband's name? Uriah. He had an interesting background.
The Hittite.
Not the Jew?
No.
Oh, and he hung around with David and was aware of the fact he was a Jew. Was there any suggestion that he had a positive relationship with the God of Israel?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, you read in 2 Samuel,
he had a much higher character than David did.
So take that down.
Yeah.
We can note in Daniel chapter 4, there was a pagan king by the name of Nebuchadnezzar who extolled and worshipped the God of Israel after his interesting bout with boanthropy, and the entire Babylonian...
That, by the way, is a mental disease where you think you're a cow.
Verified today.
Yeah.
We can also note other examples of that where all of the Babylonian Empire was told, under pain of having your house burned to the ground, have regard and honor for the God of Israel. They were at least made aware of this God's existence and had access to the Jewish people, who, by the way, weren't stingy with the knowledge of their God, if we can go off of Daniel and his three friends' witness. We can talk about Artaxerxes Longimanus and his regard for the Jewish God when Nehemiah, as his cupbearer, was in service to him and was used in a very interesting way to fulfill the prophecy made in Daniel chapter 4 and verse 25. We can look at other individuals. We could note the pagans, obviously, that were living during the time of Ezra, who supported the reconstruction of the temple. And interestingly enough, the Samaritans who opposed it, they were not of the Jewish covenant, but they were aware of the Jewish God. We can go even further into the Old Testament and note people like Job during the time of Abraham, by the way, that he and his three friends had not only a working, but a competent and borderline philosophical understanding of the God of Israel, despite the fact that Israel wouldn't even show up for another 2 generations.
And Job was not a Jew.
That's what's key.
Yeah,
So we can go on and on with this, but we have examples of people who somehow had a right relationship with God despite having no direct contact, or at least an indirect association with the people of God, that came to a relationship with their God. How? The same way we do. They looked forward to the coming of Messiah. We remember back. The difference is either, and this is the argument made, Albert, by the people you probably heard this from, that, oh, well, if something hasn't happened yet, that means that it doesn't exist, as if the promises of God are only in existence the moment that they're fulfilled. You trust God and his character the same way that we trust our future resurrection on the basis of what God has done in the past. How would that be any different to the people who were anticipating Messiah? God made a promise in the past. While it was different than Jesus' resurrection, it was tangible enough, say, for example, with the people of Jericho and a woman by the name of Rahab, who knew not only about the God of Israel, but the name of the God of Israel, what he had done in Egypt, how he had given them victory over the Canaanites. It was Sihon and Og on the other side of the river. And somehow she was willing to work with this past information, come to a present conclusion and say, will your God spare my family? And they said, put a red cord out your window, will not only spare your household, our God will protect you. And interestingly enough, Jericho's ruins, available that you can see today, the only part of the wall that didn't fall, according to Joshua's record, was her family's home. So again, we look back to the promises of God, expecting their fulfillment in the future. That's true even today.
Yeah.
Why would it be any different in the Old Testament? It's an inference, but an informed one, because we have the sort of people who weren't Jewish and still benefited from the promises of God,
right,
or recognized as righteous despite either existing before the existence of Israel or having no direct association with the law. And of course, we see that the method of their salvation is in no way different than ours today. The only difference is the variables.
Yeah. And the question always gets raised, okay, great, but what about the people even today who've never heard about Jesus? How is God going to deal with them? Well, the Bible doesn't, I believe, leave that to our imagination either. In Acts 14 and verse 17, we are told, nevertheless, God did not leave himself without a witness, and that he did good, gave rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. In other words, Paul was making the case to these thoroughly paganized individuals in Iconium that the true and living God hasn't been withholding his knowledge even from people that didn't, say, have a direct connection or an impact from the Jewish people. It even goes beyond all of that. There's a fascinating book, and because our time is not unlimited, there's a fascinating book written by Don Richardson, who's a cultural anthropologist. He was a missionary to the Sawi and Dani tribes in Irian Jaya, which is the east side of the island of New Guinea. And what Richardson discovered was what he called the Melchizedek factor. Here you have this guy Melchizedek who literally comes out of nowhere, being a priest of the Most High God. Abraham's so impressed with him, he gives him a tenth of the spoil and allows Abraham to bless him. In the book of Hebrews, we're told that the one who blesses is greater than the one who's blessed. Pretty amazing stuff. And he calls it the Melchizedek factor, in that God isn't limited to say what we as human beings can figure out, that he does have a way of getting to his message to people by a couple of different ways. Richardson, in his book, Eternity in Their Hearts, details a number of different incidents where unreached people are reached with the gospel because God has put a key to their hearts in their culture, and that the goal of the missionary is to discover that key to their hearts that God has already planted there. There's some amazing stories that Richardson shares with, even pertaining to his own family. But for time's sake, one of the most remarkable was the story of the Karen people who live in modern-day Myanmar, used to be Burma. And there was a missionary who was working with the Karen for over 20 years, not a single convert, very resistant to the gospel. He was about ready to give it all up and go to somewhere where he could be more fruitful. But his sister sent him, right before he left, as a birthday present, a brand new Bible with gold leaf on the outside of it, as we often see. Well, again, this missionary was opening up his package and looking at this Bible when one of the Karen tribesmen came in to ask him a question. And the Karen tribesman looked shocked, ran outside, came back with the entire village outside of this guy's hut, including the chief. And he's going, "What's going on?" And the chief said, "You've got the book." And he said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, you need to understand the background of our people. We didn't always live here. We migrated from a place far to the west of here. And while there was a famine, our people left their ancestral land. They got into the mountains. They were starving to death. And so they prayed to the mountain gods for deliverance. Well, the true and living God judged our people and said that the knowledge of him would be taken away until someone came to tell them about him with a gold leaf book." And they said, "You've got the book." And the missionary didn't know what else to do. He started reading John 3:16. And to a man in this village, they all gave their lives to Jesus. To this day, the Karen people in Myanmar are even persecuted by the secularist communist government in Myanmar because of their dogged commitment to the gospel of Jesus Christ. They are missionaries there in that area in Myanmar. So, when we that question, what about the one who never heard? Well, God's got that covered. He can reach seemingly unreachable people using, avenues that we can't even begin to comprehend. So, when that question comes up, though, Sean, one of the things that I always try to go back to in it all is this. When it says, well, what about the person who never heard? What are these people that live in this different time? Right. And so, okay, great. You do live in a time where you have access to the gospel. You have heard the message. What are you going to do about that? Yeah. And when you personalize that, it can be pretty powerful. So, yeah.